G'day viewers. So I've had a couple of questions about English longsword, which I'm going to attempt to answer. The first one is about basically what sort of sword is suitable, what sort of sword should you be using for it? And that's actually an interesting question. Often you'll hear people who say do fiore argue about what size of sword they should be using. Some of Fiore's techniques not possible if your sword is too long, for example. And the Lichtenarians, some people swear blind that it works much better with a much shorter longsword than normal. Others that it works much better if you've got a much bigger sword than normal. And of course, there's nothing in the text that tells you one way or the other. All you're left to do is interpret the pictures, which is a bit dodgy. And as Silver said, that's the problem with these Continental lot. They never tell you the perfect length of their weapons. Anyway, when it comes to the English material, although, there are certainly obscure parts of it, at least we know exactly what sort of swords we're talking about. So let's talk about the weapon first. So the first sort of English two-handed swords that we see are like this. They're basically a straight cross, a triangular blade, fairly well tapered, often a little fishtail type pommel there. And when you see these used in marginalia, they're being used in one hand as often as they are in two hands, often in conjunction with the shield. So you see single-handed use as often as you see it being gripped in two hands. So these are obviously what the English would have described as a bastard sword. By the time we get to the mid-15th century, which is exactly when the Harleian manuscript was written, we actually know exactly what sort of two-handed swords it's talking about, because we have a bunch of them. In the Castellane hoard in particular, there was a barge full of English weapons that was recovered from the river, and it contained a number of two-handed swords like this, and similar finds have been found throughout Britain, and we know that these are sort of a fairly typical mid-15th century English two-handed sword. Again, straight cross, not particularly long handle, and again this fairly typical fishtail pommel is common. The blade is again triangular and tapering. So it's really just the same as the other sword, except made bigger. And it is a big sword, okay? These were considerably longer and heavier than any sort of standard feather that people tend to use as a longsword these days. They're quite a large weapon. And as time progressed towards the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, the design pretty well stayed the same, but they did get even bigger until they start to approach greatsword proportions. Not quite as large as European greatswords, but they did get significantly bigger than even this.
Young Colin cleaving of our beam, at every thumping blow, cried, and told his wife, and told his wife, and told his wife, who the cause would know, that make the wedge much farther go, Lovejoy at night.
Now Liddell is early 16th century, and he says nothing about the sort of sword he's used, but it can be deduced from what he's doing with it that it was a bastard sword, okay, because pretty well everything that you're doing with two hands, he expects you to be able to do with one hand, and not just the right hand, but the left hand only. You expect to be able to throw cuts and control the weapon with both the left and right hand separately, which is really impossible with anything heavier than something like this. And that gels very closely with what Silver recommends, which is a two-handed sword that is the same perfect length as your single-handed sword and weighed so that it can be used in one hand as well as two, for both blow and thrust. And then, of course, old George goes and contradicts himself and says that, well, okay, maybe a larger two-handed sword has the advantage over the smaller one so long as it's not too heavy. And he contradicts and becomes a bit inconsistent on that. Now, we know that these large swords continue to exist. Swettenham has a pair of them on the cover of his manual. And there's no doubt that when Silver's talking about the advantages of different sort of weapons, that a lot of what he says makes a lot more sense if you're talking about a big two-handed sword as opposed to a little bastard sword. And why the contradiction? I think it has to do with the sort of swords that were around at the time. So we know that there were the big two-handed swords getting upwards to great swordish size around in Silver's time. But we also know that bastard sword-like weapons were starting to be made with complex rapiery type hilts like this. And a lot of what Silver says makes a lot more sense if you consider that, well, maybe the two-handed sword that he's recommending, the short, light one that you can use with one hand as well as two, was something like this, a typical 16th century two-handed sword with a bit of a complex hilt. You often see these described as riding swords. They have all sorts of different hilt arrangements. Which tells me that they weren't very successful, that they never really settled on a design that really worked. But a lot of what Silver says about the advantages and disadvantages of different sized two-handed swords makes a lot more sense if you think, well, the smaller one has a complex hilt, because once that hand is taken out of the equation, the extra weight and length of the big sword becomes much less of an issue, and this probably has an advantage. Now, you will note that neither of those types of sword, the light, short bastard sword or the great big two-hander, is the same size as your average standard length feather that people use for, say, German swordsmanship, which is the things that you could commonly buy. The attitude seems to have been with the English that you want it light enough to use in one hand so you can use a shield in the other hand, and if it's too heavy for that, you may as well make it really, really big so you can hit people really, really hard with it. So if you're looking for a practical trainer to represent either of these things, first thing to say is a standard feather is not necessarily wrong in that two-handed swords of those dimensions and that sort of weight did exist in period. The English did make them and have them. But because we're working with specific manuscripts from specific places and times, it's obviously better to get a sword that is most closely resembling the sort of thing that they want you to use. So for Leadle stroke Silver, you want a relatively short, light feather. Now, Reginier do a thing called the short feather. This is one of them. And when it's short, it's like, you know, an inch shorter on the handle and an inch shorter on the blade than the standard Reginier feather, but it is much, much lighter. Now, as with all these things, mileage will vary. You can pick two of these things up and one will feel like a beautiful single-handed sword and the other one will kind of wallow and not be quite right. So if you can handle one before you buy it, that's great, or maybe specify if you're ordering one, I want it to feel like a single-handed sword, because weight and balance for a good single-handed sword is very different to a long sword. But if you can get a good Reginier short, that's a fairly good simple solution for a bastard sword that you can handle with one hand. VB also makes some really nice light feathers that work exceptionally well, and some of the Reginier blunts rather than the feathers also feel really good and perfectly usable with one hand. If you want a complex hilt around them, that's a custom job. You're going to have to find an armourer who can do that sort of thing for you. If you are playing with the Harleian manuscript, then you are going to want something significantly bigger, and that means custom work. And in fact, it's difficult to find sword makers who can, like, physically make swords
longer than a standard feather. I have a feeling that the reason we get swords the size that they are is to do with the limitations of what can be easily made, not so much historical accuracy. So this beautiful, beautiful blunt was made for me by Ancient Forge in Spain, and it is a magnificent piece. If you want a fetter, I got a fetter of the same dimensions, and this was made by SGT in Canada for me, and it is also a really, really fantastic sword. So I can recommend either of those two makers to produce a sword of the correct dimensions to do Harleyan, and you will find that the extra length and the extra weight does change the way you use the sword significantly.
So in conclusion, if you're going to be doing Harley, you want a big sword of the dimensions of the two-handers from the Castellane horde and similar examples that you find in museums throughout Britain. If you're doing Lettle, you want a bastard sword. You want something that you can swing comfortably with one hand as a single-handed sword. The length is not so important. Okay, it can get a bit above perfect length according to Silver, but the weight is very important to keep down and manageable. If you lose the access to the single-handed stuff, you lose a lot of the system. And when it comes to Silver, if you want to do Silver's longsword, you're either going to be using a big one, slightly bigger than the Castellane ones, or you're going to be using one of these 16th century riding sword type things with some hand protection around the front hand, and that would be my advice.